Today we are having speak to us Dr. Ian Greene, and it's on our ethics, integrity, and democracy alive and well in the Canadian public service. Democracy is based on mutual respect, which means free and fair elections, human rights, ethical government. How well are we doing with current standards of ethics in politics and the public service? How successfully are they enforced, and how could they be improved? These standards involve conflicts of interest, lobbying, election financing, whistleblowing, expense claims, and public sector accountability. This presentation will contextualize some of the past and present scandals involving both Canadian public servants and elected politicians. Is there a trend towards less accountability, and are ethics being compromised as part of a larger problem within society? The speaker will offer hope, and suggestions for the future, and argue that democracy is not a spectator sport. Voter apathy makes it very fragile. Dr. Ian Greene has the title of University Professor at York University in Toronto, and as of July 2013 is semi-retired. He's a member of the School of Public Policy and Administration and has taught at York University since 1985. Prior to this, he worked for the government of Alberta for 4 years and taught at the University of Lethbridge. He's published numerous articles and 7 books, 2 of them with U of L Professor Peter McCormick. Dr. Greene has taught courses in Canadian public law, the Charter of Rights, judicial administration, program evaluation, political ethics, Canadian government, and public administration. He's very busy. He was the inaugural director of York's Master's Program Public Policy Administration and Law. He was an associate dean in the Faculty of Arts from 1997 to 2000. He has been a coordinator of the Professional Development LLM program in administrative law in Osgoode Hall Law School. He's a member of the board of directors of the York Collegium for Practical Ethics and the Centre for Public Policy and Law. From 2003 to 2004, he was chair of the York University Senate, and he's been a frequent media commentator on ethics issues in politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Greene. I'm sorry, Ian. Ian, who's Peter? Ian.
But I'm privileged to be referred to as Peter because tomorrow I'm going to be at the celebration for Peter McCormick's retirement. And of course, Peter hired me to teach at the University of Lethbridge in 1981. And we've done a lot of projects together in the past and will do so in the future. It's just such a privilege to be here today. When I lived in Lethbridge from 1981 to 85, I came to SACPA as often as I could. And I'm really pleased to see that you're as feisty as you always have been. And you're keeping democracy alive and well. I got interested in ethics and politics in 1986. I started off with a contract job at the university, at York University, and I was applying for jobs all over the place. I had to write something about public administration. And this was the time of the Sinclair-Stevens scandal. And nobody had written about conflict of interest in cabinet ministers. So I did, got the article published, and got hired. So that's how I got interested in ethics and politics. But it's been a great interest of mine ever since then, as well as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about why I think ethics is important in democracy. I'm going to talk about what I call the ethics regimes in Canada, with a focus on conflict of interest in lobbyists, some current ethics issues, and where we need to go to make improvements. So I've argued for about 20 years that democracy is government based on the principle of mutual respect. Where does that principle come from? Well, every great world religion that I've studied emphasizes mutual respect. The philosophy of liberalism, which has been developing for the past 300 years. And by the way, every political party in Canada, every major party is a small L liberal party. That's an advertisement for Peter McCormick's political theory classes, if you want to take one of them. One of the great theorists of liberalism was John Locke, who justified the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688 by talking about the importance of treating every individual as an equal. He talked about the importance of the rule of law, the importance of judicial independence and impartiality. And so much of the political system of the United Kingdom, Canada, the Commonwealth, the United States is really based on the philosophy of John Locke that came out of a thousand years of struggling for democracy in the United Kingdom. And I'm very interested that the current research in philosophy and the human sciences, much of it shows that human beings are altruistic creatures. We want fairness. It's part of our genes to want fairness. So, stemming from this principle of mutual respect, the basic principles of democracy follow social equality, freedom, including all the freedoms listed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, free and fair elections, and then deference to the majority, protection of minority rights, and integrity, which is honesty, treating everyone with respect and consistency of values. And the current ethics rules that we have in Canada are really based on these 5 principles. So in the 1960s, we really had an honor system in terms of ethics and politics in Canada. Then we got into a number of scandals. Just about all the ethics rules that we have now are a result of scandals. Not all of them, but most of them are. And prime ministers and premiers began setting out guidelines for their cabinet ministers with regard to conflict of interest and how to avoid conflict of interest. And rules began to develop for public servants in terms of avoiding conflict of interest in their own workplaces. Eventually, cabinet ministers had to disclose their non-personal assets, that is, everything except their home and their vehicle and their cottage. They had to be disclosed either to an official or to the First Minister, and they would be given advice about how to avoid conflicts of interest. But the critical moment was the late 1980s in Ontario. Now, there have been political scandals in Alberta from time to time, but it was pretty bad in Ontario in the late 1980s. 3 prominent cabinet ministers were accused of being in serious conflict of interest situations. David Peterson, the premier, had guidelines, but all of the cabinet ministers interpreted them differently. So the former lieutenant governor, John Black-Aird, was asked to investigate and make recommendations. So what he found is nearly all the cabinet ministers had violated the guidelines set out by David Peterson in some way, usually a very minor way. But in order to prevent this from happening in the future, he had 3 recommendations. First of all, the conflict of interest rules should be put into legislation so that it's very clear. Second, there should be a conflict of interest commissioner who meets all the cabinet ministers every year to look at their disclosure statements, explain the rules, and tell them how they can avoid conflicts of interest. And third, the commissioner should have the ability to investigate allegations of breach of the rules so it doesn't have to be dragged through the press for a number of months before there's finally an inquiry, as in the Sinclair-Stevens affair. So the government put this into effect as a result, and only it didn't cover just the cabinet ministers, it covered all the elected members of the provincial parliament in Ontario. And the system has worked extremely well since then. The first commissioner was Gregory Evans, a retired Chief Justice of the High Court in Ontario, and I got to know him quite well in doing my research about ethics and politics. And what he said is the best thing about this system is the personal meetings that he had every year with all members of the legislature to explain the rules and also say, here are some pitfalls based on your personal assets. This is what you need to do to stay out of trouble. And if you have any questions, phone me. Don't just guess. So since that time in Ontario, there have been a couple of allegations of conflict of interest. Well, let's say one allegation every 2 years. We had about 20 allegations in 1988 alone, and quite a few before that, but just once every 2 years since that time. For the last 15 years, no one in the legislature has been found to be in a conflict of interest situation. So it's worked extremely well. So the next province to follow Ontario's example was British Columbia. You remember Bill Van der Zalm, the sale of Fantasy Gardens. Well, in order for Van der Zalm to show that he was honest, he said, well, I'm going to institute the Ontario system, and I'm going to ask the new commissioner, who is a retired Superior Court judge, Ted Hughes, to investigate these allegations against me. And of course, Hughes, being a terrific straight shooter and wonderful investigator, very quickly found that Van der Zalm had accepted $20,000 in brown paper envelopes, and that was the end of his political career until recently, and the end of the Social Credit Party in British Columbia. The next province was Nova Scotia. They adopted the Ontario system, which has since become known as the Canadian model. But except that instead of having an independent commissioner, they designated a Superior Court judge who would do the investigations if necessary. Then Alberta in 1992, because of concerns that Don Getty might be in a conflict of interest because of his holdings in the oil patch. And then all the other provinces and territories followed suit right up until 2004, when finally the House of Commons adopted the Canadian model. And of course it was because it was a reaction to the sponsorship scandal. And then the Senate adopted that in 2005. I've done a bit of research into the impact of having these independent ethics commissioners in all the jurisdictions in Canada. This is just up till 2006, but a student of mine did some research right up to 2014 in terms of the average number of conflict of interest events, that is, serious allegations of conflict of interest against cabinet ministers, before there was an ethics commissioner and afterwards. And there's been a dramatic drop in just about every case where there's a new jurisdiction that adopts this system. It takes a while for them to get used to it. But it's been amazing in terms of preventing conflict of interest scandals right across the country. And now this system is being copied in many other countries around the world, especially in Europe. The Americans just have trouble believing that we can actually have independent officials who can decide on conflict of interest. Their system is much more partisan. They have to have a committee that has to decide on guilt that makes partisan decisions. So we're way ahead of the Americans, but they'll catch up eventually. Now, what about lobbyists? Well, lobbyists are necessary. They've always existed. And in the last several decades in Canada, lobbying has become a more specialized profession. Back in 1972 to 3, I was working for a cabinet minister in Edmonton. And several times a week, I often met lobbyists. And I learned a great deal. I was able to advise my minister on a number of policy issues thanks to these meetings. But I did my best to consider their advice impartially and give what I considered my impartial advice to the minister. But of course, the lobbyists very often wanted to take me for lunch or dinner. He was the Minister of Tourism, so I was offered stays at hotels and so on. And I turned all these down. I would not even accept a cup of coffee because I didn't want to appear to be beholden to anyone in terms of my job of advising the minister. So nearly always in Canada, like the conflict of interest regimes we have, lobbyist legislation has come after a scandal. There are a few exceptions. The Ontario Lobbyist Registrar, on her own, has had some success in persuading the Ontario legislature to improve the system, even without a scandal. And Ed Stelmach pushed for lobbyist legislation in Alberta, not because of a scandal, because he was afraid there might be a scandal unless Alberta had lobbyist legislation. But the first lobbyist legislation in Canada was a result of a scandal. Frank Moores was a friend of Brian Mulroney, former Premier of Newfoundland. After he finished his term as Premier, he became a lobbyist for Airbus. Air Canada was still a Crown corporation. He was appointed to the board of Airbus, and so he was a lobbyist for, he was appointed to the board of Air Canada, and he was a lobbyist for Airbus. Is there a conflict of interest there? Clearly, this was really embarrassing. So Brian Mulroney created a consultation process, which was excellent, and it led to the first lobbyist legislation in Canada in 1988, became effective in 1989. But the goings-on during this period eventually led to the Oliphant Commission of Inquiry a few years ago, and it found that Brian Mulroney had accepted $175,000 at least in cash, and that 95% of that money came from Airbus. So I'm just going to do a quick review of some of the ethics regimes we have in Canada and provincially at the present time. So federally, we have a Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner for the House of Commons. Mary Dawson was actually the person who helped to draft the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. She is very, very good. But she advises the Cabinet, all federal MPs, and about 3,000 public office holders, order and council appointments, who are covered by the federal conflict of interest rules. In addition to the federal legislation, there's a code of conduct for the House of Commons, which is pretty similar, which creates a bit of confusion. I don't think there need to be two documents. We have a Commissioner of Lobbying since 1989, and that's Karen Shepherd. She does a terrific job. Then we have a Public Sector Integrity Commissioner who's in charge of whistleblowing legislation. That legislation did not work very well to begin with. Many people tried to blow the whistle. They didn't get any help whatsoever, but that person was fired. We have a new commissioner who I think is doing a pretty good job of trying to protect whistleblowers and investigate allegations of whistleblowing. There's a privacy commissioner for Canada and an information commissioner. These are really specialized ombudsmen. Unfortunately, we don't have an ombudsman of general jurisdiction for the federal public service. There have been many attempts over the years, but none has succeeded so far. So that's one of the gaps, I think, in terms of the ethics regimes in Canada. What about Alberta? We've had legislation that was enacted in 1991, as I mentioned earlier. It's been fully in force since 1993. But also the legislation in Alberta covers senior officials, deputy ministers, board and agency chairs. There are 87 people in this category as of 4 years ago. I haven't had time to update that. And it covers, for public servants, there's a code of conduct and ethics for the public service in Alberta. It was revised in 2005. There's legislation that covers public agencies since 2009. So Alberta is one of the leaders in this field. Now, since we've had the legislation that covers the legislature, there have been 23 investigations about alleged conflict of interest in the legislature. Only 3 were substantiated up until 2010. I haven't had time to update this. We have a wonderful new commissioner, Margarita Trussler. She was a colleague of mine when I was at the University of Alberta. She's a former judge. She is a very straight shooter, no-nonsense person. And I really do think that having the background of a judge helps with regard to having a conflict of interest commissioner. So I'll talk about one of her recent decisions later on if I have time. But look for her term. I think we'll see a lot of improvements. So in Alberta, the commissioner meets annually with all members of the legislature. That happens in 8 of the provinces. It does not happen yet with regard to the federal parliament. And the result is that there are more allegations of conflict of interest, more confirmations of conflict of interest with regard to the federal cabinet, federal MPs, than any other jurisdiction in Canada. So I've been advocating for years that they need to have these personal meetings, but anyway, they prefer to have their names dragged across the headlines of the newspapers instead. I guess they like the punishment. So there's a very good code for public servants in Alberta, and a good system in terms of accountability for keeping to the code in Alberta. I don't think there's enough training. That's one of the areas that we need to improve. There's a lobbyist registry in Alberta since 2007. So everyone who is either an in-house lobbyist or a professional lobbyist has to register, and you can go online and see who is lobbying who with regard to what issues. Alberta was one of the first jurisdictions in Canada to create an ombudsman, I'm delighted that my former boss at Alberta Social Services, Lorraine Harrison, is here. And I remember once I was investigated by the ombudsman, the Alberta ombudsman. My staff was really terrified, and I said, no, this is going to help us, because if we're doing something that if we could be doing something better, we'll get advice. But I'm pretty sure that we run a pretty tight ship, and it'll be found that we did proceed correctly, and that's what happened. So I'm proud of Alberta for being one of the first jurisdictions to have an ombudsman. Let me just skip ahead. To one of the innovations that Ontario has. It has a conflict of interest commissioner for the public service. This is a retired judge, Sidney Linden. And what he does, he has a very small office, but he provides the training that I think is currently lacking in Alberta for the people who are responsible for the ethics code for public servants. And he does an absolutely terrific job. Toronto is an interesting case because as a result of scandals in the early 2000s, the City of Toronto now has a very tight ethics regime. There's an integrity commissioner who is independent and did find that Rob Ford had violated the code of conduct for City Council on a number of occasions, but she claims that he now understands what a conflict of interest is. So it shows that it's working. There's a lobbyist registrar. I think one of the places where we can experience the most corruption is at the municipal level. So I'm delighted that Toronto has an excellent lobbyist registrar. We have an ombudsman, and we have an auditor general for the city. But that's only as a result of very serious scandals in the early 2000s that we have this system, and it's something that I think other cities in Canada can copy. So let me say a little bit about Diane Finlay in my last 3 minutes. She was in the news 3 days ago. She was Human Resources Minister in 2011. And the Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson, found that she showed favoritism to a project that was applying for $1 million for a community center in the north part of Toronto that wanted to improve accessibility to handicapped people. But that application was bumped ahead of a lot of others that were more meritorious. So the commissioner found she was able to investigate on her own allegations of the conflict of interest that had been in the newspapers, and she found that Diane Finley had shown favoritism. That is a conflict of interest, because if you can't show favoritism to yourself in public office, but neither can you show it to your friends or your political party. So this was done for political reasons. But the problem is there's no enforcement mechanism. It's really up to the Cabinet or the House of Commons as to what punishment there should be meted out to Diane Finley, and it appears there will be none. What about the Senate expenses scandal? Now, I could go on for another half hour, but I'll go on for 1 minute. This is really a result of the whole debate on Senate reform that was really initiated by my friend Peter McCormick. I'm going to be talking a bit about that tomorrow at his celebration. But I think Senators Duffy and Wallen realized that they were bringing in a lot of money for the Conservative Party, and they felt that they were entitled to something extra. They didn't live in the provinces for which they were appointed, so that was an open invitation to, I think, make expense claims that they weren't entitled to. Anyway, the Duffy trial is coming up pretty soon, and a lot of interesting information will come out. I do hope that we do get some positive reforms that come out of this particular scandal. The Senate has a really excellent regime for conflict of interest, but not for expenses. So if you cover off corruption in one area, you have to look at the other areas where it might happen. So I think that ethics, we're actually getting better in Canada. We have a more ethical political system than any other country that I know of. That may be hard to believe, but we have made huge contributions and huge strides forward. There's a lot more to be done. Some of the improvements we have to make: we need to have the Canadian model with regard to conflict of interest in all municipalities across the country. It can be done very cost effectively. In 1991, the Royal Commission on Electoral Reform recommended that all political parties should have their own codes of conduct that are enforceable internally. You can't always enforce ethics from outside. I've been offering to help any political party that wants to have its own code of conduct in terms of how to develop it and how to enforce it. But nobody's asked me to do this so far. But I'm still making the offer. I think that's one of the big reforms that's needed. We need an ombudsman of general jurisdiction for the federal public service. And we do need to have a conflict of interest commissioner for public servants, not just for politicians, but for public servants in all provinces, like they do in Ontario. So I think I'm right on time.